I'm really sorry. Hello and a very warm welcome to Raj Malhotra IAS. Today is Saturday and we'll be taking up the miscellaneous topics for the current affairs of this week. So we have 4 different articles today that we are going to take up, and they are in conjugational articles. One is interlinked with another. See, firstly let us discuss the index of today's article. Our first article, it is with respect to an article that is published in the Down to Earth, and it is also published in the Hindu newspaper on Monday. It talks about how do we conserve biodiversity, and with respect to this article we will be taking up the various in situ and ex situ methods of conservation of biodiversity, and then we will take up another article which talked about the Nilgiri Biosphere Reserve, in which the plantations with respect to tea plantations which are in some trouble. And the next article is regarding a Madras High Court judgment, which the Madras High Court gave a judgment stating that from now on the cattle cannot be traded within the forest area. So this is the rights based issue, that is a conflict of interest between the Forest Rights Act and the Tamil Nadu State Forest Rights Act, as forests being the concurrent list subject. Now it is a tussle that is going on. And lastly, there are also news articles which talked about the biodiversity hotspots in India, and it is important for us to conserve this biodiversity hotspot. It is said by the COP meetings, and additional COP meetings, that are sumoto COP meetings, have been held. Those things also we are going to discuss. Right, let's quickly begin with our first article. See, this article talks about here how do we conserve biodiversity. With this, firstly we have to know that it is a static topic, but still the current relevance of this topic is very important, because mostly application based questions on this will be asked in your examination. So in this context we will look into what exactly is biodiversity and what are the types of biodiversity that you get to see. You get to see various types of diversities in this world, right, when one from the species level to the molecular level. The diversity can be at the species level, the diversity can also be at the molecular level, and it can also be at the genetic level, right. So in this context, let us try to understand the biodiversity conservation. The conservation methods mostly either include in situ conservation or ex situ conservation, right. Before we go any further, I wanted to introduce to a new term called co-extinctions. Why is it important for us to introduce this biodiversity in this world? Rather, our earth has its own capacity to conserve its diversity, right. So here you have to understand a term called co-extinctions. Co-extinctions hota hi kya hai? If you know, please comment it down. See, co-extinctions means in this world every species is dependent on another species. That means one species is dependent on other species, that means their existence and their survival also depends on another species. You take an example, if a plant becomes extinct, and the animal that eats this plant will also become extinct, because over a period of time this animal cannot get the food that it is required, right. This is called coexistence. Now for this, let us try to understand through an analogy. Imagine you are flying in an aeroplane, and the aeroplane has many nuts and bolts, small nuts, big nuts, like that, right. So likewise on this world we also have many different kinds of species, and this kinds of species diversity is called various biodiversity. एक biodiversity component में species का diversity कहाँ जाता है. Imagine these species are nothing but your bolts and nuts of an aeroplane. So it is said that around the elephants in India are endangered, and there are some critically endangered species जिनका मतलब ये है only 50 to less than 50 population is left. What if these populations die over a period of time? It means that you are losing one or the other nut and bolt which is able to fly that aeroplane. Over a period of time, what happens is that when all the nuts and bolts in that aeroplane loses and falls down, it is the aeroplane which carries the human beings that will be collapsed, right. So directly or indirectly every species on this world is interlinked. Without our knowledge we are interlinked with other species, that is called co-extinctions. So in order to survive on this earth, it is important for us to coexist together, right. In this context, let us try to understand the conservation types of methods which are used in the biodiversity. Firstly, the biodiversity methods that are used are in situ conservation and the ex situ conservation. In situ conservation means conservation on the site itself, then and there. That means in the natural habitat you are going to conserve that particular site, and the other site conservation is ex situ conservation. So this ex situ conservation means maybe an example can be your zoos, right, your zoological authority, or it can be your home gardens can be an ex situ conservation methodology, or it can be a botanical garden. These are the examples of the ex situ conservation methods. But for our interest, what we have to learn here is the in situ method of conservation. The first in situ method of conservation is biosphere reserves, right? And the other forms here are sacred groves. Sacred groves means those plants and species which generally people pray them and they protect them over a period of time. In some villages, what happens is that most of the tribal community, they pray the banyan tree or they pray the neem tree and they protect that tree. That kind of plantations are called sacred groves. In Maharashtra, there are more than 1,000 sacred groves which are under protection, right? Mostly hilly areas, these kind of protection take place, and that protection takes place in that place itself. That is why it is called in situ protection. And nextly, biosphere reserve, will come to this. Apart from this, there are national parks, there are wildlife sanctuaries. These are some of the examples of the in situ conservation methods. Now, biosphere reserves can be both marine biosphere reserves. If you know any marine biosphere reserve, please comment it down there, and terrestrial, right? This is the broad classification of the biodiversity conservation with respect to the global level, and there are definitions that are given to each and every term. A biosphere reserve at a greater level can be considered to be a hotspot, right? And this hotspot is given a definition. Suppose an area where there are more than 1500 native species, 1500 native species, and these 1500 native species are endemic to the local area, then it is considered to be a hotspot. Along with that, another condition is that 70% of the total native species till date might have been extinct or at the threat level, their threat levels are at a greater height, right? So these two conditions will form biodiversity hotspots, and in India there are around 4 biodiversity hotspots, right? If you know, please comment down in the comment section what are the biodiversity hotspots, right? So here Suchita says that Gulf of Mannar. Rohit Bharadwaj says okay, Gulf of Mannar is one of the example, and in Andaman Nicobar also we have marine national parks. Along with that, marine biosphere reserves also. Part of Kutch is also part of your marine biosphere reserve as well. Now, in this context, what you have to understand is the difference between national park and wildlife sanctuary. ये भी हम देखेंगे. Before that, let me quickly give you the list of ex situ conservations. See, ex situ means in the non-natural form. Maybe the cryogenic preservation can be called as ex situ, right? Cryogenic preservation, that means anything you store less than -197 degrees Celsius, then it is called cryogenic preservation. These days, whenever a new baby is born, their stem cells are being stored, right? This stem cell storation can also be considered to be as a ex situ conservation. That is also one of the type of molecular diversity, right? Along with that, you also have other kinds. They are zoos and botanical gardens. These are also the examples of your ex situ conservation, right? Now let's quickly get back to the in situ conservation and what are the methods of in situ conservation and how exactly is the government of India defining the national park and how is it different from a wildlife sanctuary. And then later we'll understand the hotspots of India, where exactly are they present and under what circumstances are they there in India, right? Firstly, let us look at the national park. See, both national park and wildlife sanctuary, they both were given under the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972. Under this Wildlife Protection Act of 1972, there are 6 schedules that have been given. 6 schedules, right? Each schedule is given certain level of protection, and this protection level is given to the certain areas, right, and certain species. Like that, Schedule 5 in the Wildlife Protection Act deals with the vermin species, and Schedule 6 deals with the plants and other species which are threat and which are not much of use. If you know any of the plants which are part of the Schedule 6, please let me know. Have you ever heard of a plant named marijuana? Cannabis? Cannabis are usually put into the Schedule 6. See, in the Schedule 6, what happens is, recently there are some countries which have actually legalized the cannabis. For example, Thailand as a nation has legalized the cannabis for the commercial use as well as for the domestic uses, right? Now coming to the Schedule 5. Schedule 5, under this category, there are vermin species that are put under this. Vermin means anything that can harm your crops and anything that can harm day-to-day life of an individual. Under these circumstances, whenever a state government declares that this animal is a vermin, then you can kill that animal under certain circumstances, right? That is called a vermin. For example, Nilgiri in Gujarat is a vermin, and Nilgiri in some other states is also a vermin category. That means whenever it damages your crops, you can actually go and kill it under the protection category. Now there are rhesus monkeys, they are also wild boars, and wild pigs, they are also under the vermin category, right? Apart from that, if you look into the differences between the Wildlife Protection Act and under the Wildlife Protection Act and the differences of the national park as well as the wildlife sanctuary, the first type of definition that comes into your mind is that the definition of an IUCN. And before that, I wanted to ask you a question. So, is forest a state subject or a central subject? Is forest a state subject or a central subject? Is forest a state subject or a central subject? Please let me know in the comment section. See, the biggest problem in India is that forestry is a concurrent list. Both state government can make list and central government can also make list. So, any law that is made by the state government can be replaced by the central government, and central government laws always prevail in the concurrent lists, right? This kind of concurrency in terms of legislations with respect to the Forest Rights Act of 2006 and the Tamil Nadu State Forest Act, एक conflict है. Recently Madras High Court ने भी एक judgment दिया था. This judgment we will be discussing in other 10 to 15 odd minutes, right? Before that, let us quickly understand that forests are part of concurrent list. That means both state government and central government, they both can make laws, right? Now, the definition of a national park and the definition of a wildlife sanctuary is given by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and they are also being defined by the Wildlife Protection Act. In this act, Wildlife Protection Act also defines of 1972 also defines tiger reserves क्या होता है, conservation reserves and community reserves as well. Community reserves. Along with community reserves, conservation reserves, tiger reserves, national park and wildlife sanctuary have these 5 components have been clearly defined in the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972, right? Now, get back. There is also a different definition which is given by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. Now, what is this International Union for the Conservation of Nature? IUCN is the oldest body with respect to the conservation of biodiversity and biosphere in the world. So, it has been formed somewhere in the 1950s. It is considered to be the oldest, and it has a nominated member status in the United Nations. Along with that, it is also an intergovernmental body which works independently, right? And IUCN gives the list of each species that are present in this world a status, right? Under the Wildlife Protection Act, India also categorizes them in different status. So, as a whole, even the national parks and wildlife sanctuaries can also be put into these kind of status. So, Wildlife Protection Act के through the national parks and wildlife sanctuaries are categorized as category 4 and category 2. National park is under category 2 as well as wildlife sanctuary is under the category 4 type. That means the protection status for the wildlife sanctuary is low as compared to the national park, right? And the ultimate aim of a wildlife sanctuary is to protect one single or couple of species that are present to the area. But when it comes to the national park is a larger area, and the ultimate aim of the national park is to protect the biodiversity of that area along with flora, fauna and the ecosystem that is involved in that area, right? Now, covered under which law? Both are covered under the Wildlife Protection Act only, right, of the 1972, right? Along with this, official permissions are required or not to access the places. In order to access the wildlife sanctuary, you need not require any permission, but in order to access the national park, you need to have a permission from the Chief Wildlife Warden. He is the ultimate authority for giving the permissions. Now, boundary lines are not clearly defined and they are flexible in the wildlife sanctuary, but boundary lines are strictly marked in the national park, and these boundary lines are very, very important for the national park. And numbers at present, there are more than 540 wildlife sanctuaries in India, and the number keeps on growing, right? And who has the authority to declare a particular area as wildlife sanctuary? Is it the state government or the central government? If you know, please comment in the comment section. Now, with respect to the numbers of national parks across the India, there are around 104 national parks, right? There are around 104 national parks, 104 national park, right? Now, when it comes to individual rights over the land, suppose if you have your home in the wildlife sanctuary, you can actually stay within that wildlife sanctuary. But if you will not have any rights in the demarcated area of your national park. You will not be given any kind of rights. See here, if an individual's land falls in a sanctuary, he has the rights over that access. But when it comes to the individual's access with respect to their private property, they will not own any private property in the national park, and national park will be having a greater protection status. Along with this, you need to understand a couple of other differences: the biotic interfaces and the degree to which residents can inhabit or introduce a biological control agent's ability to effectively and establish them. This in terms of, in simple words, biotic interface. Biotic interface means your interface with the animal interface, the man-animal conflict. In order to address this, for some research purposes and for some developmental purposes, there have been limitations that are given and limitations that have been allowed to. Now, in order to understand the human limitations within the boundary of a wildlife sanctuary and a national park, hunting, grazing, cultivating, these kind of activities are clearly not allowed in the national park, right? See, you have to understand this thing because the next article, whatever we are going to discuss, it is based on this particular component only, limitations on human activity, right? But through settlement is not permitted in the wildlife sanctuary. For grazing, collecting firewood and the minor forest produce can clearly be accessed from the wildlife sanctuary, because wildlife sanctuary is meant to protect those animals but not the ecosystem of that particular area, right? Now, the other category is the gene pool conservation done or not. In both the cases in India, the gene pool is not conserved in any of the protective areas. Any of the protective areas in India, the gene pool conservation is not done. Visitor policy, both people can visit. Tourists are permitted into the wildlife sanctuary and restrictions are far less. But when it comes to the national park, it is not exactly and clearly opened for the wildlife with respect to the national park, but they can be given certain kinds of access in terms of research, and camping activities and adventure activities can at times can be limited within a particular area, right? If you happen to visit any of the wildlife sanctuaries, please let me know. So gene pool conservation क्या होता है? See, gene pool conservation means, for example, we are individuals, humans, right? My genes are different from your genes. Like that, every individual has a different genes. If at all, any individual species genes are conserved over a period of time in order to protect that species. For example, cheetah has been extinct in India. If India had undertaken the genes of cheetah and preserve them, maybe today we might be in a position to conserve cheetah over a period of time. This is called gene pool conservation. Now the gene pool conservation can be done with respect to species, with respect to entire ecosystem, but these kind of activities are generally a practice that you see in the United States but not in India. आज तक हम कोई ऐसा gene pool conservation नहीं कर रहे. Gene pool is nothing but, for example, another example is that stem cell storations. Stem cells होता है ना individual का, if you store those stem cells, if at all something happens to an individual at the age of 15 or 20, any disease, from that stem cells you can actually regenerate the body organs, or you can actually fight the diseases that a person is facing at the age of 15, 20 or later stages. So if you conserve those gene pools, in the future, if at all a species is going to get extinct, with that help of the gene pools we can conserve them, right? These are some of the examples with respect to the differences between a national park and a biodiversity, national park and a wildlife sanctuary. Now in this context, a larger area of biosphere reserve can also be considered to be a hotspot, right? Firstly, let us try to understand what exactly is a biosphere reserve. See, biosphere reserve, firstly, biosphere means an area where there is lithosphere, that means there is land, and also there is an area that has hydrosphere, that means water, and along with that there is also atmosphere, an area that has complete set of living habitats. This is called biosphere, and this biosphere is a greater area. Like that, in India there are 18 biosphere reserves, right? 18 biosphere reserves are there in India, and these can be marine, and they can be, one can be marine and other can be terrestrial. Terrestrial means on land, marine means within the water, right? So a larger area of biosphere reserve with 1500 or more species that are present and that are vascular plants and native to India. They should be native to India or native to a particular place, and out of this 70% of their habitat, if it is lost, then it is considered to be a hotspot. Like that, in India there are 4 hotspots, and across the globe there are 36 hotspots. In India, if you see, our hotspots are interlinked with the foreign nations as well, right? The first hotspot is Western Ghats and Sri Lanka. The second hotspot is your Himalayan region, which includes Pakistan and some parts of Nepal, Bhutan also. The third region is Indo-Burma region, and the fourth region is the Sunda land. These are the 4 biodiversity hotspots which you can get to see in India, right? See here, the first biodiversity hotspot, which is in Himalayan regions. See, this Himalayan region biodiversity hotspot, it includes not just India, it is also includes Tibet, Nepal, Bhutan, China and Myanmar. So India में कुछ हिस्सा है, right? And the second one is Indo-Burma region. Indo-Burma region includes your northeastern states except Assam, northeastern states except Assam, and some parts of Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia and South China also. And the third biodiversity hotspot, which includes the Sunda land. Sunda land means the entire region of the Southeast Asia is considered to be a Sunda land. This entire region of Southeast Asia, which includes Malaysia, Indonesia, ये पूरा एक region which has 1500 vascular plants which are native to this area, and they have lost 70% of their habitat. Along with, in this region, Nicobar Islands also falls into this region. Here we have Nicobar Islands, right? ये जो Nicobar Islands है ना, that falls into the Sunda land category. That means the plantations in this Nicobar Islands are of the type of Malaysia, which are similar Indonesia. इनकी जैसा plants they are present in the Nicobar Islands. That's the reason why in India we have the 4th one, that is under the Nicobar Islands, and the last one is Western Ghats and Sri Lanka. See, the plantations of the Western Ghats are more or less similar to the Sri Lankan plantations, and they are native to this particular area. That's the reason why it is given as Western Ghats and Sri Lanka, right? Let us quickly look into the map here, and except Assam, this is a wrong map. Sorry to get this map. You take off this Assam, the entire northeastern region and the some parts of the Southeast Asia, right? This is one. Secondly, Bhutan plus some parts of Himalayas, this is the second one, and the third one is Sri Lanka plus Western Ghats, and the fourth one is the Sunda land, right? This is the Sunda land, that means Nicobar, right? These are the examples of the hotspots in India, right? If you have any doubts, please comment in the comment section. Sir, hotspots are areas which are endangered species or have diversity of species. See, this is a question, this is asked by Kriti. Hotspots are areas where there is 1500 species. There is a clear definition of hotspots. Let me directly take you to the website itself. There itself you will get to understand. Just a minute, guys. See, let us quickly get into the official website of the biodiversity hotspots. See, here it clearly mentions two conditions for the, these are the two conditions. I hope you can see. To qualify as a biodiversity hotspot, a region must meet two categories. Now, it nowhere mentions that it is endangered or it is on a population basis. It clearly mentions that the number of species, it must have at least 1500 vascular plants as endemic. Endemic means it is particular to this area. I hope you got it, Kriti, right? Secondly, it says that it must have 30% or less of its original nature vegetation. That means only 30% of the vegetation is left and the rest is around 70% of the vegetation is lost, right? Clear? This is the definition from the official website itself. Let's come back. These are the areas. This is a map of the Himalayas. Here you get to see it is not just India, some parts of China and Bhutan are also part of this hotspots, right? Now let's get into the second article. Here the article speaks about Tamil Nadu's strong opposition to court ban on cattle grazing in the forest land, right? Tamil Nadu. In the Tamil Nadu, what happened is that the High Court of Madras High Court has banned grazing of cattle within the forest area, right? Under which act it has been banned, or why did the government get into this, why did the court has entered into this picture and banned someone who have been grazing these cattle for the last 60 to 70 odd years, right? Apart from this, the same news article is also given in your down to earth. So I have interlinked with both the articles and here we go ahead. Firstly, let us try to understand this article first. Here a particular species called Malaimadu. Malaimadu is one of the species of cow. It looks like this. This Malaimadu cow is majorly meant for not milking, that means mulching. It is meant for getting the feed. The cow dung of this cow is used for the production of various other elements in the South India, right? Especially parts of Tamil Nadu. Here we have to understand few different contexts. Firstly, we have to understand the concurrent subjects, the concurrent list of the Indian Forest Act. You already know, I have already told you that the forestry is part of the Indian concurrent list of the Constitution. Secondly, here you need to understand the issue. Let us consider this issue here. So this is the Madras High Court. It has said that it has banned the entire grazing of this cattle in the forest area, right? And it has taken into consideration two different acts, right? What are these acts? It quoted Article 21 and it has also taken into account Tamil Nadu Forest Rights Act, right? These are the two articles under which it said that cattle grazing in the forest area need to be banned. Under the Article 21, it is said that the Article 21 do not only deal with the life and the personal liberty of an individual, protection of life and personal liberty of an individual, but at the same time it also takes care of the life of the cattle as well. So this is something which you get to see new here while quoting this judgment. in this context, let us try to understand. See, forests in India are controlled by Forest Rights Act, right? Let us keep this issue aside. Firstly, we have Forest Rights Act of 2006, and this Forest Rights Act is also called as Other Traditional Dwellers Rights Act or Other Traditional Forest Dwellers their Rights and Recognition Act भी कहा जाता है, इनको ही Forest Right Act बोला जाता है, right? Apart from that, every state has a State Forest Act, right? These are some of the facts which you have to know. Now let's get back into the article here. In this article, the court has set up an amicus curiae. Amicus curiae means someone who can come and mediate between two disputing bodies. For example, you and me fight and the court tells that bring the third person and ask them to mediate between these two people. He or she is called amicus curiae. So when an amicus curiae has been set up between the cattle grazing community as well as the forest department, this amicus curiae has given certain kinds of viewpoints. Let us try to understand what are these viewpoints and why the court has to take the viewpoints of the amicus curiae and finally ban the grazing of this particular cattle in the forest area, and what happens if this cattle is being banned or to enter into that forest area for its grazing, right? Firstly, see, cattle density inside the forest, it is said that it creates a negatively affected principle. How? There are two kinds of herbivores, one that lives in the wild and one that is in the domesticated area. Now the domesticated area is nothing but your cattle, and the wild herbivores are nothing but your deers, elephant and some kind of rhinos, right? It is said that whenever these cattle are being allowed to enter into the forest area, along with that the cattle grazing men or community, they are linking up with the poisoning activities of the internal area of some forest, right? Poisoning means in order to protect their cattle, what they do is they put some poison whenever there is a wild animal that is approaching. This is one kind of entity which has been listed by the amicus curiae. And they also said that cattle transmitted diseases are some diseases that are being entering into the food chain, right? Whenever you take this cattle into the forest area and graze them, along with that there are some diseases that are being spread into the interiors of the forest. For example, anthrax. Anthrax is one such disease. Along with anthrax, you also get to see the foot and mouth disease and lumpy skin disease, right? Anthrax, foot and mouth disease and lumpy skin disease. So this is we are talking about the viewpoints from the amicus curiae the court has taken into consideration. These are all the negative points. We'll also consider the positive points of this article, right? And it is said that illegal trespassing of the cattle holders into the Megamalai Wildlife Sanctuary has resulted into the forest fires. So whenever cattle are entered, that means there are also forest fires through which they can happen, right? Along with that, the cattle community, that is Malaimadu. Malaimadu is a cattle. It is a special breed, and this breed is not utilized for the milking, but it is utilized, the cow's dung is utilized for making other products. So it is a commercial utilization and not a organic utilization. That's the reason why this cattle should not be entered into the forest area, right? This is something the amicus curiae said. Along with that, some cattle grazers are being befriended to the poachers. They give the information to the poachers. Whenever they give the information to the poachers, because of which more animals are being put to threat. Now there are some provisions related to the entry into the sanctuaries under the Wildlife Protection Act and the Tamil Nadu Forest Department. So as you already know that these are the points that have been taken into consideration by the amicus curiae and the court. Now let us look into some of the points from the different direction with respect to constitutionality, right? Here you need to understand the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972. The Wildlife Protection Act of 1972 and the Tamil Nadu Forest Rights Act. Wildlife Protection Act of 1972 puts some restrictions on entering into a wildlife sanctuary. Now where exactly is this issue going on? It is going on in Tamil Nadu, especially in the Megamalai Reserve. Which reserve? It is a wildlife sanctuary earlier after 2021 they have converted this wildlife sanctuary into a tiger reserve, right. So section 16 of the Tamil Nadu's Forest Rights Act, it states that the authorities may be permitted to allow cattle grazing into the forest, but the Forest Rights Act of 2006, it clearly gives an individual, especially the tribal communities who live in and around the vicinity of the forest, they have the grazing rights when they enter into the forest. Now when there is already a right, that is Forest Rights Act, which gives their rights, which gives them the right to enter into that forest for their grazing, why is it that the court has said you are not allowed to graze your cattle in that particular area? It is because the court has taken into considerations of the Tamil Nadu Forest Rights Act and not the Forest Rights Act of the 2006. So it is up to the court which perspective it want to take, right. Now in this context, we have to understand with respect to our UPSC examination, the conflict between the Forest Rights Act and the state introduced rights of the forest. That means like Tamil Nadu, every state has its own right. Now this is a center state relation with respect to the forests, right. In this context, what we have to understand is the concurrent list variations with respect to the forest. So any act that is made by the center will always prevail with respect to the forest, and states can also make its own rights. So there has been some protests that are going on that they want this cattle to be entered into the reserve, right. Now grazing cattle, particularly the native Malaimadu species, has traditionally been in place since ancient times, right. Now look here, there is a community grazing rights which I have already told you under the Forest Rights Act, they are already given. Apart from this, now let us try to understand the positives that are being enshrined in the Forest Rights Act that these individuals are facing over a period of time. See, generally, even if the cattle is allowed to enter into the forest area, if there is a forest fire will help in regeneration of a particular area. Forest fires are nothing new, forest fires have been happening in the forest over a period of time, they are nothing new to us, but the rate at which the forest fires are happening, that need to be considered. So there is another research report which says that whenever this cattle enter into that particular area, the forest fires are at the same number even now and in the past also, right. Now the species are for manure rather than mulching, this is what being said by the forest department. Apart from that, if you look into the biodiversity angle of this species, see, biodiversity is generally more in the grassland area. If a cattle is sent into a grassland area, that means that cattle is helping the regeneration of that particular area, because and it is also helping in not spreading the grasses over a larger area, right. This is what it has been said by the amicus curiae, right. It is also says that grazing is recognized as a wildfire prevention tool as well. If Malaimadu breeds these to survive, that means if Malaimadu breeds need to survive, there is only one solution, that is allowing them to feed on the Meghamalai Tiger Reserve, right. Now see, let us also understand the court's angle. Court ने क्या बोलता है? Look here, back in 2021, this Meghamalai was once a wildlife sanctuary. Wildlife sanctuary को it has been converted into a tiger reserve. So whenever a tiger reserve is put in, it comes under the Wildlife Protection Act, plus it gives the greater protection area of Schedule 2. Schedule 2 protection area दिया जाता है. So the court said that instead of sending them into the interior of the forest area, what you can do is you can use the buffer area, but this buffer area is the area where the settlements are taking place, right. This buffer area is the area where you get to see the settlements, and wherever there are settlements, grazing is very difficult, right. And finally the court said that it is the Article 21 of the Constitution not only protects human rights but also rights of the species, and the protection of the environment was an inseparable part of the rights to the life. Protection of an environment, it said that it's not only protecting the cattle, but at the same time it is also protecting the environment of the forest, right, by not allowing this cattle into the interiors of the land, right. Just a minute, Please explain Article 21 again. See, let me explain you in a different way. This is an area which the code said the cattle need not to be entered, and this is forest area, right? This is the forest area. Article 21 says the code today has not just protected the individual, but also the area of the forest. Forest area also the code protected by banning the cattle from entering in this area. This is what is said here, right? The Constitution not only protects human rights, but also the rights of other species. Protection of environment was an inseparable part of right to life, right? Right to life, protection of environment is also important. This is what it is said. Clear? Now, let us quickly take up another article here. This is an ongoing issue. There is no judgment which has come up. Whenever there is a judgment, we will take up this article again. Now, there is a question that how wildfire and cattle are linked. See, wildfire and cattle are linked here in different ways. Firstly, when you take the cattle goes in herds, right? There are around 20 to 50 cattle, they will get into the forest area. When they enter into the forest area, what happens is that these are grasses, and mostly the cattle will be reared in the grassland. If you know about the grassland ecosystem, you have to understand one thing: the nutrition of the grassland is always in the soil and not in the grass. When you understand the tropical rainforest, the nutrition is always in the vegetation and not in the soil. That's why the soil of the tropical rainforest is always bad soil, not a good soil, but the soil of the grasslands is always a good soil, right? If at all, if you stop this cattle entering into the forest, the grasses keep on growing, right? Grasses keep on growing. When the grasses keep on growing, what happens is that in the months of summer, especially in Tamil Nadu and in other interior parts, the forest fire is a recent entity. Every now and then you get to see the forest fires, and there can be an encroachment of new shrubs which can dry very quickly and they can encroach this forest area, right? If you stop this cattle entering into this particular area, that means you are also aiding the forest for fires, right? Clear? This is one reason. And the second reason, counter reason, look into this reason here. The same forest, if at all the cattle is being allowed to enter in, along with the cattle, there are cattle rearers who go into the interiors, where they intentionally put fire because the cattle rearers and the forest employees are not in good relation. In order to take the revenge, these cattle rearers, they go and burn the forest at the end of the grazing season. This grazing season starts in the month of just June ke baad, August and September. These are the seasons when the grazing they start. Once the September ends and before June, before even the grass grows, what they do is they simply put the entire area on the fire, because the new grass can grow very quickly, because as the grass is burnt, there is potassium that is sent into the soil, which give more nutrition and quickly the grasses grow. So over a period of time, what happens, they create an intentional forest fire. So intentional forest fire, what happens here, whenever there is an intentional forest fire, there are some seeds. The seeds can open up only when the fire can give that heat to that particular seed. For example, this is a small seed. This small seed in the natural environment cannot open up, cannot give a seedling, but if you give enough fire around it, it can open up. So forest fire can also open up certain seeds, and forest fire A larger scale of forest will clear the entire forest area. It is both positive and negative, but the kind of intentional forest fires are some things which are at a concern. Now the court clearly said that these are domestic cattle. Domestic cattle के लिए 10 to 15 kgs of grasses are needed per day, and they can be procured by other means. Because of these cattle, when they are sent into the interiors of the forest, there are other animals which are considered to be wild herbivorous. ये wild herbivorous जो है, like deer, elephant and other big animals which rely upon the grass, their food and fodder is at a threat. So it is a positive entity and it is a negative entity, right? For our examination point of view, what we have to understand here is there is a community called Malaimadu, which is a native breed of cattle, and on the Malaimadu there is a complete community that is depending upon this cattle. So we have to find a solution. Now what is the solution for this? The way forward is nothing but approaching this article, or what approaching this court's judgment should be revisited. The experts say that there should be a revisit of this entire judgment through the Forest Rights Act and not through the Tamil Nadu Forest Act. Under the Forest Rights Act, these communities are already given certain kinds of rights within a territory of the forest. They can take their cattle and they can graze in only for non-exploitational purposes, right? For organic regeneration, organic reproduction. But this cattle, the forest department says that this cattle jo hai, in a cattle it will not give milk, it will give good cow dung and it will give good byproducts, which this byproducts they are being used for the commercial entity. So should we send this commercial entity productions jo chal raha hai, can we allow them into the forest area just because they are native to that particular area, right? Clear? Now there is a question from Amulya Agarwal, sir, but will these forest fire not hurt the animals? Yes, of course, forest fires will hurt the animals. The forest fires are meant to not just for clearing the forest, but they also they'll hurt the animals as well, right? Clear? Any doubt? Okay, let us quickly move to our next article. Our next article here is again an environment related article which talks about tea plantations in Nilgiri's Valapari hit by inadequate supply of fertilizers. That means especially it is talking about Nilgiri, and in the same another article which talks about that elephant's death due to pulmonary hemorrhage. ये इतना important नहीं है, but still elephant's death is something which we need to take into consideration, and from our examination point of view what we have to understand is the Nilgiri Biosphere Reserve. In the Nilgiri Biosphere Reserve, what you have to learn is this Biosphere Reserve is present in which state, that you need to understand. Apart from that, you also need to know where exactly is this Nilgiri present. So let me take directly to the Nilgiri Biosphere Reserve here. In the Nilgiri Biosphere Reserve, there are 5 national parks. If you know those national parks, please comment in the comment section. See, this is Nilgiri Biosphere Reserve, and this Nilgiri Biosphere Reserve is located in a trijunctional area. Trijunctional area means, look here, it is this particular area where, look at the boundary lines. This is the state of Karnataka, this is Kerala, and this is Tamil Nadu, right? Right? And this Nilgiri Biosphere Reserve, within the Biosphere Reserve there are some kind of plantations, that is tea plantations. For the tea plantations ko ke liye what you need is, you need some kind of shade as well. You need shade and you also need some kind of nutrition. What kind of nutrition? Fertilizers chahiye. What fertilizers? They need nitrogen. Why nitrogen? Because nitrogen, okay, one question, nitrogen in the atmosphere is how much percent? In the atmosphere, how much nitrogen is present? How much nitrogen is present in the atmosphere? Please comment in the comment section if you know. 78%. Yes, everyone knows 73%, 78%. Okay, answer is 78%. When there is 78% in the nitrogen in the atmosphere, then why is the government giving subsidies in the name of nitrogen, phosphorus and potash? Can't we take nitrogen directly from the atmosphere? Can't the plant utilize the nitrogen from the atmosphere? See, this is something very critical. Though the nitrogen is present in the atmosphere, this nitrogen cannot be utilized directly by the plants. So the plant needs certain kinds of bacteria. Through the process of nitrification, through the process of ammonification, only then the plants and other forms can use this nitrogen, right? So the article here said that the article here mentions that tea plantations in Nilgiri, Valapari is hit by inadequate supply of fertilizers, right? And there are some bacteria which are known for fixing the nitrogen in the atmosphere. Those are called rhizobium bacteria, which is said as correctly said by Gopi, right? Yes, Gopi, you are right, and Suchita as well, right? Okay, I was showing you the maps, right? See, and there are 5 national parks. With respect to your UPSC examination, you have to understand the national parks which are part of this Biosphere Reserve. So for that, let me quickly take you to the topography of the Biosphere Reserve of the Nilgiri, so that you will be able to understand here. See, this is the topography of the Nilgiri Biosphere Reserve, and this has something very uniqueness in its reserves. So this Biosphere Reserve, starting from the almost plain area to reaching to the top of the Western Ghats, right? Here it is Mukurthi. Mukurthi is also a national park or wildlife sanctuary. This Mukurthi National Park is somewhere around 2550 meters height. In the north, here you have Bandipur, and here you have Nilambur. Nilambur is nothing but a teak forest. This teak forest is as old as 170 years. Teak forest is Nilambur, which is part of Kerala, is 170 years old. Along with that, you also have a national park with name Silent Valley. Silent Valley, right? And the highest peak of Doddabetta, 2637 meters, is also present here. Ooty is also present here, and there are 5 national parks. The list of national parks is Wayanad, Nagarhole, Bandipur, Muddumalai and Silent Valley National Park, which you get to see in the Nilgiri Biosphere Reserve. This is the topography map of Nilgiri Biosphere Reserve. See, this PPT will be shared in the Telegram group of the Raj Malhotra IAS. Please make sure to download this PPT from there. That's it for today. We'll be meeting next Saturday with respect to more articles which are most relevant to UPSC. If you have liked this session, please make sure to like that button and subscribe to us, so that every now and then when we come up, you will get to be notified. Thank you and take care. Okay, there is a question, sir, we have to know about hotspots. Yes, you have to know about hotspots. You are supposed to know about hotspots.